In this video, I will describe the problem we encounter when trying to describe perfumery materials to others. I will also talk about the solution to this, and finally I will walk you through this free PDF that I am showing on the screen right now that I use to describe my materials to you. First, let's talk about the problem. The problem when trying to describe perfumery materials is subjectivity, because we can't really convey smell in any other way than using words. And words are subjective. Let's say I take this material and I tell you, oh, this smells bubbly. What do you mean, bubbly? One person might think it smells like soap bubbles. Another person might think this smells like champagne. Another person might think it's a bubblegum. The point is that different people will have different associations with words, which is why it's very inefficient to talk about materials in this kind of way. Of course, you can do this if your goal is to be artistic and maybe describe the emotional effect that this material has on you. But for example, my goal is to help you visualize in your head what this material smells like and if you want to get it or not. So for me, the ability to convey the smell as accurately as possible is really important. Also, it doesn't matter what words I use or what system I use, because the only true way you will know what it smells like is if you actually smell it yourself. Now let's look at this paper sheet here. This was my first attempt to solve this problem, and I came across the idea of using spectrums, which was a neat idea because it somehow puts the things that are important about a material and it puts it in one page and it kind of organizes it. But the issue with this version was that the spectrums were quite abstract. For example, there's a spectrum with items like velvety, suede, neutral, grainy, sandpaper. I mean, when you smell a material, you can't really rate this. Or this other one is even worse. Continuous, flowing, neutral, segmented, fragmented. I mean, yeah, you can kind of use this, but it's not really accurate because these spectrums, although they are spectrums and they are better than using random words, they're not truly functional. So then I came across the idea of using only functional spectrums to describe materials. And the key word here is functional. These are things that you can actually imagine. Things that are not as subjective as the ones I had here. And the reason we're using spectrums and how it's different from just using random words, because when I talk about spectrums, and let's say I say in the spectrum of hot to cold, this is somewhere in the middle, you can already imagine what it feels like when something is not hot and cold, when something is in the middle. Essentially, when we use spectrums, we are limiting our brain to a certain amount of data, and we're giving ourselves boundaries and context for the information. I guess that's what I was trying to say. Using spectrums gives our brain context to more accurately understand the description of the material. Also, I realize it's just as important to describe the functional use, the utility of this smell, and not just what it smells like. Because a perfume is not just things that smell good together. A perfume is also things that work functionally together. I will go briefly over this PDF, not get into too much detail because you can get it for free. It is publicly available. I'm not collecting your emails or anything like that. You can just get it, download, print, and use for your own learning. The spectrums I included are likability, diffusion, humidity, complexity, edibility, realism, familiarity, temperature, texture, weight, strength, longevity, dirtiness, and nose fatigue. These are spectrums that your mind can easily understand. For example, diffusion. It is easy to understand if something is explosively diffusive, meaning you put it in the strip, you put it on your table, and you smell it from a distance away. Maybe it fills the room. That is an explosive and diffusive and loud material. Whereas if I dip the strip and I need to put it to my nose to smell it, that is an intimate or skin close material. And this you can understand. You don't need to smell the material to know what this is like, if you have any experience smelling materials. And even if you don't have smelled the material before, I guess you can imagine what it's like when you need to lean in close to smell something, because these are common experiences. Same with likability. Is this a repulsive material? Is it something you smell and you want to gag? Or is this something that you smell and it's so nice you want to keep smelling it? It's addictive. The complexity spectrum is interesting because some materials are really simple. You can only smell one thing. But some materials, like the naturals, they are often kaleidoscopic and complex, meaning you can smell different aspects of the material over time or from the start. I thought it's an interesting thing to include because some materials are similar, for example, tonka bean and coumarin, but coumarin is a very minimal and simple smell compared to tonka bean, which is complex and kaleidoscopic. I think most of these spectrums you can see here are self-explanatory. Texture is, I guess, the most abstract, difficult to understand because it's not natural for us to pay attention to this, but some materials are dry. They trigger your trigeminal nerve in the nose, which makes your face feel the material, not just smell. This is why some materials like mint feel cold, not just smell cold. It's because they trigger this nerve in your nose. And in the same way, some materials have a texture, they have this spikiness, like spices, for example. They feel sharp, not just smell sharp. I will go over two more. Weight is important because some materials feel very dense. They feel like you cannot see through them. On the other hand, if you use a lot of transparent materials, they feel like you can smell through them. Think of all the commercial men perfumes. They're often very transparent, at least in the opening. They don't feel like they weigh you down. They feel refreshing and light. Finally, the last spectrum on the right side is nose fatigue. This talks about the effect that some materials you smell and you can only smell it for a second or two before your nose gets blind to it and you can no longer smell it. This is the case for me with Ambrofix and Iso Super, whereas some materials like vanillin are very visible and lingering. This is what this spectrum talks about. Finally, let's look at the bottom part of this PDF. The big diagram is how I see perfumery materials, how I try to group them. In my mind, I have materials that work towards the core smell, and then there are materials that work towards the structure more than the smell. For example, vanillin, I would say, is a very core smell, whereas something like civet or indole, they add tension and complexity. Or something like dihydromercenol is more for the brightness function. It modifies the core smell. You can see you have the big circle and then you have the small ones on the side. Those small ones are modifiers. There's not just one kind of modifier, they have different functions. And the reason I put this diagram on this page is because when you smell a material, it's helpful if you try to put it in one of these boxes, because next time when you need to do this function in your blend, you would know where to go and what material to get. For example, if you know that dihydromercenol helps with brightness, or hedione also does this, then next time you need brightness, you would go and you would know, oh, I have these two materials that I can use for this. And it's important to mention that a material can have multiple of these boxes checked. It's not just one. In fact, I bet most materials have multiple functions, not just one. A material can contribute to the core smell and also the structure. For example, vanillin. It does make the perfume feel sweet, but it is also a fixative material, which means your perfume will last longer. At the very bottom of the page, you can see different circles and some vocabulary. The circles you can color in to just remind yourself of what kind of colors there are to choose from. And the vocabulary, I try to put things that are not in the spectrums, other things you may want to use to describe a material. And the reason they're important is because vocabulary is important in perfumery, and not knowing enough vocabulary will just make you feel like you cannot describe this thing. Since words are really the only way we can describe a material, we cannot draw it or sing it, we need to use words. So expanding your vocabulary is quite an important thing, especially if English is not your main language like me. I needed to expand my vocabulary so that I can actually describe the things I'm smelling. Something that can help with this is reading the descriptions of other perfumers who have smelled this material. It wouldn't just unlock your ability to describe this material yourself, but it may also introduce new facets of this material to you that you did not notice. For example, somebody talks about metallic smell and you did not realize that this material has this, but now you start to pick it up. This can have an opposite effect as well. Maybe you start to hallucinate a smell that you don't really smell, but perfumery is very not strict about this, meaning you can smell this and literally call this, I don't know, dog hair, and if that's what you associate this with, then nobody can tell you that it doesn't smell like dog hair. And this is why I say that the spectrum way of describing materials is the most efficient if your goal is to communicate the smell and help other perfumers understand it better.